Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another video. So today we're doing the second part in this series on the unity of form and concept. This is the sequel example portion, discussion portion of a video I posted maybe a month or 2 months ago called the unity of form and concept. If you haven't seen that video, I definitely recommend watching it before you watch this one, since this is basically the example and discussion portion of that video. So I'm not going to be re-explaining the concepts from that video. We're just going to dive right in. These two videos were initially born as a lecture and discussion that I designed and presented as part of my MFA teaching skills class. And I really wanted to bring this presentation to YouTube because I was proud of it. I thought it was really interesting, but I felt like it needed the discussion portion. Obviously, in an actual class or in my lecture that I gave, I was able to assign a reading for people to read and then we could all show up and read it. You can't really do that on YouTube, and so this was my solution, was to do the first half of the video and then tell you guys what story we were going to be looking at. Give you a Google form where you could submit your thoughts on the story so I could share your thoughts, so it could be a discussion and not just like me yapping. So today we're going to look at a piece of experimental fiction, a piece of speculative experimental fiction that I am just so excited about. A friend sent me this story and was like, read this, you'll love it, and I did, and I'm obsessed with it. I was like, I'm immediately putting this on my syllabus and doing a lecture on it and teaching it on YouTube. First of all, I'm going to read and talk about the story that we're using as an example, which is 10 excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Ratnabar Island by Nibbity Sen. Then I'm going to share your guys' responses to the questions in the Google form that I shared, emulate a class discussion, and then finally we're going to look at a quick interview with the author to kind of see what her intentions were. Hi everyone, I'm just making a quick little addendum here. So my original plan for this video was to go through and read the story and like make a commentary on it line by line, kind of like in my video of breaking down Los Angeles by Ling Ma. But as I read over the story, I like barely stopped to say anything, because pretty much anything that I would have commented on, you guys had talked about in your responses that I was going to discuss later. So it ended up basically just being essentially a straight through reading of the story. I have removed the reading portion of the video. The story literally is only 1,400 words, so I would recommend just pausing right now and reading the story. I've left it linked in the description. It will literally take you less than 5 minutes to read. It is a super short piece, and I think that that just makes more sense than me reading the whole story, which takes like 15 minutes in what was already a very, very long video. The one thing that I've left in is just I had a little discussion on the title and how the title is functioning in this piece that I wanted to leave in, since that's not something that came up in the responses. After the little chat about the title, things are just gonna awkwardly jump right into discussing your responses. That's where really like the meat of this video is, and yeah. So anyways, that's my addition. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Also, obviously, this story is about cannibalism. It also talks about colonialism and, you know, forced relocation of colonized people. It is a horror story, technically. The details of the cannibalism are quite sparse. It's not gory or anything. So as we can see by just from the title, this story takes the form of an annotated bibliography. This is something she signals to us immediately through the formatting. This is an experimental story that you can tell is experimental, first of all, just from the title and also just from looking at it. And one thing I actually want to note immediately is how she uses the title. She uses a technique that you actually see most often in poetry. In fiction, we're used to titles being thematic or plot related. She does what you often see in poetry, which is using the title as essentially an instruction manual for how to read the story. We know we're supposed to read this as if it's an annotated bibliography, and she's also giving us insight to the concept, so we kind of have a sense of orientation. We know already that it's going to be about the cannibal women of Ratnabar Island. The title isn't something thematic. It tells us immediately what the story is about and, most importantly, how to read the story. And I think that in an experimental work like this, that's really important. We do have to change how we're used to reading fiction to read this story. It doesn't look like a standard story on the page, and our brains aren't going to process it like a standard story. And she sets the stage for that with the title. Now, do you always have to use a title like this if you write an experimental piece? No. But I do think in this case, it's very, very smart, and the title itself is in unity with the concept. We can imagine that if this was an actual annotated bibliography, it would be called something like an annotated bibliography on the Cannibal Women of Randabar Island, right? Title is quite literally exactly what the story is, but it functions as a hook. It functions to tell us what the story is about. We don't have to spend those opening paragraphs of what is a very short piece figuring out what the story is about, because we know from the title, and we know how to read the story from the title. We're just gonna look at some of the responses that you submitted. I first of all want to say no one is wrong. Every response that I read was interesting and insightful and engaged with the story. That's one reason why I'm really excited to share all of your thoughts, because your range of opinions is so much broader than what like mine alone can encompass, right? I have this broken up into 2 questions. We're gonna go through them one by one. If I don't share your response here, it's not because it wasn't good. There's so many great responses here. They were all fantastic, honestly. It's just because a lot of people do touch on the same points, and at a certain point I don't want to be repeating myself too much, but I will leave a Google Doc with all of the responses. So the first question, which was actually like a 3-point question, oopsie, was what formative choices does the author make in this story? How did these choices impact the storytelling, and what did these choices convey to you as a reader? So let's take a look at some responses. So this first response here from Jackson says, telling the story through sources for a sociological paper has a major impact on how the story is told. It makes the truth slippery. We see several different accounts from different times and perspective, which builds a larger story from conflicting ones. This adds a nice level of depth, but also may make us reflect on the real world and who has a right to tell certain stories of a certain people and who has a claim to the truth. It's also very engaging because it's making the reader work just a little more to decipher what's happening, as opposed to more traditional short fiction. I think that that's a very concise and just really true response. So then I wanted to share this response from Helena, which I really, really appreciate how detailed your response was, Helena. So thank you so much for sharing this really, really great response here. I really love the choices the author made. As an academic, I'm instantly in detective mode, piecing together a complex picture from these excerpts, collecting their perspectives, and also looking for the frictions. I like how you say frictions. Jackson says slippery, which seem like antonyms, but in this case, both are true. The form is creating both friction and slippage, and the thesis argument that might emerge. The bibliography format allows the author to include a multitude of voices across time, and so create a past-present dialogue, and also include multiple identities whose positions themselves are commentary. The naive Victorians and their casual colonialism, the white academic elite and their well-meaning but fraught feminism made me feel uncomfortably called out, well done. The more personal expressions of the fictional diaspora / victims of colonization. Type of publication cited, academic books, blogs, interviews, letters, highlights power dynamics between the voices and where they speak from. While the bibliography as a form levels the playing field, it puts all entries on equal footing. This is especially well done as it highlights how this case is rooted in a colonial past. It performatively embodies how that story has been sensationalized and co-opted by a white-centered academy, and is even now co-opted in the name of feminism. I loved the Kristeva comment. While also allowing the victims' descendants' voices to be heard, to let them speak back. I could go on. Sorry, I am a literary scholar, and this short story is gold. Thank you for sharing this. I love how you talk about how this form both highlights hierarchy in terms of academia and publishing, but also within the form of the story is able to then dismantle it. And I also really love that point of the past-present dialogue and the dialogue between the different perspectives. This is a multi-POV story, right? 10 different perspectives, arguably more than 10. The way that they are situated within the story against each other and in context of the entire piece creates dialogue both directly and indirectly. Sometimes they directly reference each other, right? Like the comment about Kristeva. One of the earlier pieces mentions Kristeva, and then one of the later pieces literally says like, please stop quoting Kristeva at me. So it feels like there's like this direct conversation. And then we also have cases where that friction between the different voices is just based on how they are positioned against each other, both within this text and within the world. This is from an anonymous. You touch on something really, really interesting. One interesting choice is the gaps left in the narrative. The annotations are supposedly excerpts from larger works, and they have many missing pieces marked by ellipses. These gaps seem to mirror all the lost information in the story. Details about Ratnabar Island, the massacre, what Emma and Gina did, how these writers are related to each other, and on and on. The holes get filled in a little as the story progresses, but you are still left with the feeling that you don't have the whole picture, and it takes some effort to reconstitute the narrative in your mind. This is likely how the girls from Ratnabar have felt about their own history. I love this comment because this is something that I hadn't thought of. I love how you looked into the negative space in the story of what's not being said, what was omitted from the text, because I think that that's a really important part of the story, and it's something that I had dwelled on and reflected on very, very minimally, but those gaps are just as important. What we aren't shown is likely so much, I mean, it is not likely, it is definitely so much broader than what is shown. This is a 1,400 word story. It's like an iceberg. We have gotten a fractional amount of the truth. Like, we get a full story, but we don't get the full story. So I love how you really thought about the gaps in the narrative and how that's signaled literally with these, you know, missing pieces marked by the ellipses. So here I've got a response I want to share from Inkling, who says, the medium itself is a collection of English language written works and concerns a twisting of a culture we are made complicit in. The concept is the friction between the capacity of the academic form and the responsibility to imagine and manifest outside of it. The crediting of sources gives more inherent legitimacy to third-party ethnographers and collections of lived experiences than lived experiences themselves. Great point. Drawing attention to the limits of the form. I love how you note that what makes the form of this story so interesting and so effective is greatly because it draws attention to the limits of the form in an actual academic context. The ellipses, so frequent throughout and in one case mid-sentence, remind the reader how much isn't being shown. The achronological description of Yates and Gore's meal as a known horror first and an educated consensual act second reifies the dehumanization of the 1900s and draws a direct line between the colonizations of then and now. As a reader, I feel most stories assume the job of bringing me toward a character and viewpoint by pulling, seducing. This story does so by repulsing. I love how you note this tension point, these different ways of creating tension by seducing versus repulsing. I feel kind of both seduced and repulsed in different ways by this story, in ways that I don't normally experience in fiction. So here's a really interesting response from LHF. A bibliography as structure is genius. I found myself checking the dates of each piece and trying to put together the chronology of events and the imagined academic discussion that the compiler of the bibliography is engaging in. The last line revealing that the writer is related in some way to the women taken from the island recontextualizes the whole thing as a work of family history, which is wild and so interesting. I'm imagining being the writer and reading all these things that have been written about my family. It's another layer to the horror element of the piece, which is more horrifying. Women who eat people, or the way people talk about it, reduce it, project ideology, etc. I really like your point about what the last line does in the context of this being a horror piece and asking us what the true horror is. You know, we have a lot of articles written by British academics who seem to think that the true horror is the cannibalism. I think you're very right. What this story is saying is that that's not the horror. The horror is the colonial history and relocation that these women experienced. And now the way that the story is being twisted and reproduced in academic contexts. That is what the horror of the piece is. The horror is not the cannibalism. So I'm gonna share one final response to the first question before we move into the second question. This response is from Karina Dove Escobar, who says, the author chooses to tell the story in excerpts and arranges the excerpts in a list like a bibliography. The choices portray a wider ongoing discourse. The piece is short, but it feels rooted in history in the world. Narratively, there is the arc that begins at exploitation and racism and ends at reclaiming. This feels familiar because we've seen this play out in the real world, but the form does something extra. It really takes the familiar and makes a speculative scrapbook out of it. The balance of form and genre adds eeriness and intrigue. The story reads like a late-night rabbit hole. It has that manic intellectual intrigue of skimming over a wide swath of knowledge very quickly. Such a unique feeling to get out of a short story. When I talk in my video on Unity Form and Concept about creating a reader experience, I think that's really the sense of a reader experience, especially because normally when we think of reading like an annotated bibliography, at least me, I associate that with very dry, dull reading. Whereas in this story, it's like really thrilling and really engaging. So I'm gonna move into the second question, because this is actually the question that I'm really, really excited to share your responses on, which is, can you imagine the story told in a more traditional form? Or do you think these formative choices were necessary for the story the author wanted to tell? How would changing the form change the meaning or effect of the story? This is where we get a lot of more split opinions. About half of the responders were really in the camp of, I mean, yeah, you could, and you could tell the story in a different form. It would be different, but you could still do it. And the other half were very much in the camp of, no, this story is the form. Fundamentally, you could not change it. I want to share some of your thoughts because the responses to this question were really interesting. I want to share Helena's response to this question. Helena says, I think the author's choice of format is really clever, as a more traditional form for this story might have had to be a kind of historical travelogue or a case study narrating the discovery of the island or the incident at the school. Both those forms would be implicated by their rootedness in the colonizing perspective and tradition in problematic ways. Again, the bibliography creates a complex interplay and even dialogue across time, across disciplines, and across the diaspora itself, highlighting both the practices and the legacies of colonialism, while also eliminating the hierarchies between the bibliography entries in a way they are assembled here, not least because the Gore women have the last word. The fragmented form allows for a complex and dynamic presentation of a story that is at once only implied, having unfolded offstage, and more complex than any single POV narration could represent. I also feel like the fact that Emma and Regina's beautifully weird and queer story not being retold in prose in any of these leaves them freer, more undefined, more mysterious. They are unfixed by any narrator, and that lets them remain a measure of agency, autonomy, to evade definition and dissection through the white colonial discourse. All in all, a truly clever story that I now want to share widely. I also want to share this story widely. I'm obsessed with it. That's why I'm making a whole video about it. I think I'm really on the same page as this response in terms of how I personally think the form feels necessary, not just for the story the author wanted to tell, but the themes. Your point about how the bibliography, A, allows you to escape, rootedness in the colonizing perspective, B, to kind of call out the colonizing perspective, and C, to create this interplay and dialogue across time and discipline, feels not incidental, but integral to the story. Not having that form to highlight those themes would not only change the effect of the story, but the story would operate thematically on a completely different level. Form is doing a lot of work in terms of theme in this piece, and I think without those formative choices, you would lose that thematic work. In a piece where the theme is not about, say, like a character's internal struggle, but is about broad topics about diaspora and colonization and who gets the right to tell what stories, how colonial histories are represented in academia, it feels to me necessary to have this format. So I also want to highlight this response, which is from an anonymous author who says, I think it would have to be much longer if it were told in a traditional form, as it covers many years of history. While the longer story would still be interesting, it wouldn't have the same effect on the reader, namely the feeling of being lost and having to get your bearings with little information. It also wouldn't seem as factual. As you read these excerpts, you might actually start to think that these were real events, whereas in a novel, they would obviously be fictional. This would detract from the impact the author is going for. I think your comment that to make this a more traditional narrative, you would have to make it much longer is very astute. The fact that this is 1,400 words long is incredible to me, because in order to make this piece a more traditional format that covers all the same information, I don't even think it could be a short story. I don't even think it could be a 4,000 word short story. It feels like it would have to be a novel. I feel like the form has allowed a condensing of this incredibly rich chain of events and history from something novel length into something that is essentially flash fiction. So I think that this is a very true observation, that to write this traditionally, it couldn't be this concise. So here's a, I guess, different perspective from John Little, who says, sure, any story can be told in a variety of ways, but the point of view of the narrator is more effectively exposed and challenged as the narrative continuity from one paragraph is effectively broken, bringing to the forefront the more subtle subtextual continuity. So this is kind of like the other perspective that you could have about form, which is that of course you can change the form. It will change the effect, but any story of course could be told in a variety of ways. So I really wanted to highlight this response because it is that flip side of how we view form. I really like that you acknowledge that of course you can tell a story in a variety of ways, but the way the form is functioning and operating in this piece is still really important and adding a lot to what this narrative is accomplishing. So here is another response. This is from Inkling, kind of more in that camp of, no, this story needs to be in this format. The formal choices were absolutely necessary for this story to exist. Using prose alone would make it a different beast, more adaptation than translation. It's difficult to answer the change in effect with a different form when I don't see an unambiguous version of this story without its current form. It could retain the plot and simply give a linear account of the Ranabar culture, but it would lose its pace and entirely its themes of cultural literary oppression. It could retain its academic context and follow Renita Gar's explanation of the version of the story we currently have before us, but it would lose its urgency, authority, and connection to the reader. Or it could retain its relationship to its framing and pick a topic to explore the indirect violence of traditional prose instead. I like that phrasing, the indirect violence of traditional prose, since that is really what this story is upending. Perhaps an expanded part 1 or 2 of this piece, which, besides losing 90% of the story's work, would lose the relationship between contrasting viewpoints and make its narrator much harder to read as unreliable. Yeah, it really is the contrasting viewpoints and forms that create such a unique form of tension in this piece and is doing so much thematic work. Here's another really interesting response from Lynn. I think this would be difficult. It would involve a lot of flashback and or exposure. It would involve probably either a very long piece or a lot of non-linearity. That would be very complicated. It would also lose the tension of the different perspectives that is now present. It would also miss the criticism of science, treating the destruction of a community as an interesting case study with little interest in the people involved. So much of the intrigue of this story and so much of the heat comes from the fact that it's actually a really removed format. Like, an annotated bibliography is quite a cold, clinical format. I think that friction between the content and the form, the coldness of the form in contrast with the heat of the content, is a really important point of tension in this piece, and a tension between form and concept. You know, I've been talking about the unity of form and concept, which I think this piece has, but I think this piece also has tension of form and concept, which is so fascinating. This response from LHF, I can imagine it, but I don't think it would be nearly as horrifying or as thought-provoking, mainly because the form is so spare. It shows exactly what it needs to and not a single other thing. Even the headers have crucial information in them. Nothing is wasted. This form also preserves an element of mystery in that we don't know what the bibliographer feels about the selections, only that they're looking. Yeah, I think that this is true. Like, I can imagine a version of this story that's told in a more traditional means, but it just loses its impact as a horror piece on so many different thematic levels. I think it would make it more of a traditional horror piece where it would put the emphasis of the horror on the cannibalism, which this story is trying to deconstruct and say the horror is not the cannibalism, the horror is the colonialism. This was mentioned by other responses earlier, how the form is able to subvert that. Whereas writing this in a more traditional means, the story would have to do a lot of work to push back against that implied narrative. So I'm going to just share one final response here because we've been sharing responses for a while. This is from Karina Dove Escobar, who says, a change in form would make the story as it exists obsolete. It would be unrecognizable. The form is the story through and through. To remove the bibliography from the story would mean a restriction. The number of voices would shrink down to 1 or 2, removing the feeling of mass commentary. To remove the bibliography would also mean an expansion. If the author were to somehow preserve all the voices, their selections would most likely be more immersive, removing that skipping stone feeling that makes the story so magnetic. Yeah, I think that to change the form, you would lose everything except the literal events, you know? Of course you could portray the same literal events of what happened, but everything in the impact of the story, in terms of what we take away from it, both emotionally as a feeling and also intellectually, thematically, would be completely different, if not inverted. So to close off this video, I actually wanted to share an interview with the author. We've been speculating this whole video on our interpretations of this story, but I think it's so valuable to hear directly from the author. Always seek out author interviews if you can about your favorite work. I feel I learned so much about the works I admire when I hear what the author's intentions were. So this is an interview with Nippity Sen, the author of the story, interviewed by Merk Van Wolfmoor. I'm not going to read it word for word because it's relatively detailed and not the entire interview doesn't focus around the story, but I just want to highlight a few key pieces that are related to our discussion. So the interviewer says, excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Ratnabar is a wickedly wonderful story about heritage and diaspora and eating people. Do you decide on specific elements or themes when writing, or do you find they develop naturally as a story progresses? What elements do you find yourself drawn to in your work, whether obvious or not? So the author says, I tend to start with a cool idea, then develop it. For example, 10 excerpts started with me going, I'd really like to write a story in the form of an MLA bibliography. As for themes, I feel like it hardly needs stating at this point that food crops up a lot in my fiction. Not just food, but the cultural assumptions and strictures surrounding appetite, hunger, and consumption. 10 excerpts is a pointed middle finger at how colonialism others and declares monstrous the very cultures it itself is in the process of devouring. This is something that we didn't talk about at all, actually. Playing with an idea of consumption and devouring. Like, this is a story about cannibalism. We didn't even touch on how this story is actually playing this reversal of you've demonized this act of cannibalism among these women, but are you not actually the ones devouring, you know, the ones cannibalizing? So now there's a couple questions that I want to read in full just because they are fully about the story. So the question goes, the paper titles and sources have absolutely wonderful and sometimes punny titles, many of which I would like to read. I take it you have much experience writing academic papers. Can you tell us about how you chose the structure for this story, and what were some of the bonuses or challenges that resulted from a unique format? And so the author says, as I like to tell people, I just survived a 3-year MFA in Illinois. During that MFA, I took a literature course on the American Gothic and later did a number of independent studies of my own designed to follow up on specific subgenres of this that interested me. All of these involved producing an annotated bibliography at some point, so I got pretty good at it, and also increasingly fascinated by how annotated bibliographies consist of interlocking components that tell a story larger than the sum of its parts. Because academic notions of objectivity be damned, a story is exactly what a bibliography is telling, one that has to be deliberately constructed. And I think that this relates to a lot of what you said in your responses about creating a story larger than the sum of its parts, creating dialogue across time and across different voices. This wasn't my first exposure to academia. I have an MA in English Lit from back home in India. As such, I was uniquely positioned to notice the despairingly white, cis-het, male, and Western limitations of my professor and classmates' perspectives as we critiqued material that often dealt with transgressive gender, atrocities against people of color, and colonialism. This got me thinking about how Western academia has been a tool of colonialism and how racist perspectives and practices are absolutely built into its existing frameworks. I'd already had the idea to write a story in the form of an annotated bibliography. Now I realized that I could do a lot more by using content to subvert the form rather than playing it straight, using the master's tools to flip the bird to the master's house, if you will. You know, this whole video is about unity of form and concept. She has unity of form and concept. Her form is integral to her themes, but she's not doing that by playing into the standards of the form as they exist in the real world. She's using the form to subvert itself. By using this framework that has been a colonial tool, she has found unity of form and concept by subverting the form. So brilliant, and I just love that line, using the master's tools to flip the bird to the master's house, if you will. The final question that I wanted to share, what I loved is how we get subtle glances of the history and lives of the characters, and the threads bringing it all together grow clearer and more sinister as the tale unfolds. The story is rich in detail and creepy elements, and it lingers in the brain, a dark and sensuous satisfaction. When you write short stories like this, are you tempted to explore the characters more in future works, or do you find that once a story is told, it is closed for good? Somewhere in between? Oh, definitely. 10 excerpts, though, is about how colonialism in academia steals and rewrites conquered people's stories, and how diasporas also engage in, albeit in much more positive, processes of retelling and remarking their heritage into their own new stories. We will never know the truth of Regina's story. All we have is versions of it that people have made up to serve their various purposes. Besides, sometimes you can make an ending more effectively horrifying by stopping just short of explicitly revealing what happens next and letting the reader's imagination do its worst instead. Which I think kind of touches on what a lot of you guys noticed, which was the blank spaces, the missing pieces in this narrative, and the tension and even the horror in those missing pieces. I'm gonna wrap up this video because it's been long and it's been a lot of reading. I want to thank everyone who submitted their responses to this video. I loved reading them and just how rich all of your insights were. Obviously this was a new format for me to try on this channel, so I didn't know, like I was like, what if no one submits, right? So I just really appreciate how engaged and rich and enthusiastic all of your responses were, so thank you so much. So that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye!